Danger Along the Ohio, Chapter 11. Dusk settled over them, with rain falling soft and steady. Clara's weak voice occasionally broke the quiet, and once, when Amos leaned over to feel her cheek, she flailed out and struck him hard on the nose.
"Melinda, don't you dare tell her all."
"She's out of her head, Amos," Jonathan whispered. "It's the fever," Amos said. The wandering phrases, the glazed, unseeing eyes, indicated she was getting worse, not better. He was afraid that without rest and nourishing food, her body could not fight off the illness. Just when they needed to travel swiftly, she couldn't travel at all. She was too sick to sit up, let alone walk. Amos considered the idea of going on alone to Marietta and bringing back help, but he knew he couldn't leave Clara and Jonathan there with the hostile Indians on their trail. Besides, he didn't know what Red Moccasin might do. Amos watched the boy rubbing the injured leg, calm, remote, accepting the pain without complaint. He's used to this hard land, Amos thought. When he's hurting, when bad weather batters him, when there's no food, he simply waits for better times. And why not, Amos reasoned. There wasn't anything else to do except wait. A heavy weariness crept over Amos, and he lay flat on the ground and closed his eyes. He'd wait too. Things would be better by morning, or worse. When Amos woke, his first thought was of Clara. She lay as still as a baby rabbit. A hand to her cheek told him the fever still raged. He had to do something, but what? Clara was the doctor. He wished he had paid more attention to her doctoring and her herbs. Then he remembered she had made Red Moccasin a tea from willow bark. He had gotten better, so maybe willow tea would help her too. But it would mean starting a fire. They could burn it just long enough to heat the water, then put it out right afterward. It'd be risky, but they had to do something. He went to Jonathan and shook him awake. "How is she?" were Jonathan's first words. "She still got the fever," Amos said, "but we're going to make a fire and boil some willow bark." Jonathan looked around. "What about the Indians?" "We have to fix her some medicine," Amos said. "Turn over one of those dead logs and see if there's still some dry wood on the underside. I'll go get the willow bark." Amos hurried down to the bank of the Ohio, eyes and ears alert to the woods around him. By the time he returned with a cup of water and several strips of willow bark, Jonathan had already collected a good-sized pile of tinder. A sudden thought hit Amos like a thunderbolt, and his eyes slid over to Amos's knapsack. Not until this moment had he considered that he'd have to pick up the pistol and pull the trigger in order to start the fire. He tried to reason away his rising fear. It wasn't the same gun, he told himself, but the thought was no consolation. The other pistol had disappeared after the accident, and nobody had mentioned it again. But Amos hadn't forgotten it. Even now, a painful image arose in his mind of the empty wooden pegs over the fireplace. After the accident, those pegs had been a daily reminder of the gun that wasn't there. Hurrying so that he wouldn't have time to think about it, Amos went and reached into the knapsack. The touch of cold metal set a shiver through him, and when he pulled out the weapon, it slipped from his fingers. He left it where it fell and backed away. He couldn't do it, even to help Clara. Ignoring his brother and watching the Indian, he knelt beside Clara and laid his hand on her forehead. He wished he could apologize to her. A few minutes later, he heard the sound of flint striking steel, and without looking, he knew what Jonathan was doing, that he was unable to do. When the clacking sound finally stopped, Amos turned to watch. Jonathan was on his knees, head almost touching the ground, blowing on the sparking tinder. A thin blue spiral of smoke rose and wafted away on the morning air. Then the flame grew until the whole tinder pile was ablaze. It was a good thing for Clara that Jonathan wasn't afraid of guns. While Jonathan fed twigs into the fire, Amos shaved a handful of willow bark and dropped it into the cup of water. As soon as the liquid came to a boil, he lifted it out of the flames and covered it with a stone. Then he helped Jonathan smother the fire with wet leaves. Waiting for the willow tea to steep, Amos watched the surrounding forest. It hardly seemed possible that Indians could be stalking them. The woods were so serene. But he knew they were in greater peril than at any time since they had come into the Ohio country. Unable to travel because of Clara, they were like a beaver in a trap. Red Moccasin must have guessed they were running from the Indians because he watched and listened too, as if waiting for something or someone. Time was their other enemy. Each day without food left them weaker than the day before. Amos felt shaky from the steady drain of going without food. He thought the hunger must be affecting his brain too, because sometimes his thoughts seemed to wander through the past and present and future, unguided and beyond his control. When the willow tea had cooled down, Amos took a stick and scraped out most of the bark. Then he lifted Clara's head and held the cup to her lips. She resisted at first, but he coaxed and commanded her until she had finished it. Even if the willow bark didn't help the fever, he thought, the warm liquid would soothe her empty stomach. Amos milked Queen Anne and gave Clara a few sips. Then he and Jonathan drank their fill. When Red Moccasin refused the offered cup, Amos squirted the rest of the cow's milk out onto the ground. Clara needed rest, and Amos knew they had to find a hiding place to wait out her illness. The river had been their guide, their sanctuary in the unknown wilderness, but now it harbored the enemy. Their only choice was to leave it. He told Jonathan what he intended to do, then picked up Clara and headed away from the Ohio. He was relieved to see Red Moccasin fall in behind Jonathan and the cow. The straggling party walked until they came across a stream gurgling between great rounded sandstone boulders. A narrow strip of sunlight slanted through the foliage and warmed the ground. Amos laid Clara down. There was shelter here and cover from searching eyes. If they could hide their tracks, maybe the Indians would pass them by. Leaving Jonathan to dredge out a pool for drinking, Amos headed down their back trail, pausing along the way to break a leafy branch from a tree. At the spot where they had spent the night, he began sweeping away their telltale tracks. Maybe the Indians he had seen hadn't even come downstream, but he had to try to cover their trail just to be sure. Even if it didn't fool them, it might delay them for a while. He erased the signs of their passing the best he could, all the way back to the stone shelter. When he saw Jonathan kneeling beside Clara, crooning soft words to her like a mother soothing a sleeping child, tears welled in his eyes. She appeared to be worse than before. Chills racked her body, and her cheeks were red with heat. Filling the cup at the stream, Amos dribbled the cool water between her dry lips, and it seemed to quiet her. As he sat down, Amos heard the marble sack rattling against his leg. He pulled open the drawstring and emptied the marbles into his hand. They felt smooth and cool like polished metal. He picked out the green agate shooter and rolled it between his thumb and his fingers, while his fist closed around the other marbles. He realized Red Moccasin was studying him from across the stream. The boy glanced from Amos's face to the fistful of marbles, then back to Amos's face again. There was a veiled puzzlement in his black eyes. Amos thought how strange it was that he and the boy understood each other without speaking the same language. Tone of voice, eyes, and hands conveyed their thoughts almost as well as words. Just now, Red Moccasin is wondering about the marbles, Amos thought. But even if we could communicate in words, I could never make him understand about Simon. The marbles had gathered warmth in Amos's hand, and for a brief moment their silky smooth heat comforted him. He channeled them back into the pouch and pulled the drawstring. His knife and his marbles were the only things he had left of his former life. No, he thought, he had Jonathan and Clara and the cow, and when they reached Marietta, he'd have his father once again. Amos came alert when he saw Red Moccasin lift his head, his whole body poised, listening. Amos listened too, his eyes darting here and there. The woods seemed eerily quiet. Suddenly, and almost silently, they were surrounded. Indians, wearing only deerskin leggings and moccasins and carrying rifles, closed in from all sides. Amos rose to his feet, clamping his jaws shut to keep his teeth from chattering. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jonathan edging toward him. Without taking his eyes off the Indians, he reached out and gave his brother a push. "Stay with Clara," he murmured. Then he squared his shoulders and took a step forward, setting his mind to face whatever would come. The Indians seemed to take Amos's stance as a challenge. They moved closer, tightening their circle around him alone. One man, no taller than Amos but much heavier, with bulging muscles, shoved Amos backwards. Immediately, rough hands propelled him forward again. Amos would have fallen if an Indian hadn't caught him in his arms. For a moment, Amos stared up into the dark, laughing eyes, and he smelled the man's closeness, a mixed odor of sweat and grease and wood smoke. Then he was sent spinning across the circle again. The men laughed out loud at his awkward attempts to stay on his feet. When Amos bumped against one of the men, he put out his hands and pushed hard, and the man stumbled backwards, grinning. They seemed to think this was a game, but Amos felt helpless and frustrated and angry. He glared at them and balled his hands into fists. Just then, someone snatched Amos's knife from its sheath. Spinning around, Amos saw a man rubbing his thumb across the shiny blade. He grinned at Amos as he slipped the knife into his high-top moccasins. A moment later, someone seized the marble pouch from Amos's belt. The thief, a lean-faced man wearing a necklace of small white shells, loosened the drawstring and dumped the marbles into his hand. He rattled them together and laughed at the pleasant sound. A sharp voice from beyond the circle halted the men's rough game. They grinned at Amos, but there was no more jostling. Amos stood still, breathing hard, as a man with a wrinkled face as dark as the forest soil came into view. His shoulder-length hair was streaked with gray. Colored beads decorated his deerskin shirt, and fringe on the sides of his leggings danced at every step. The man's sweeping gaze took in Amos and Jonathan and Clara. Then his eyes, bright with inner fire, came to rest on Red Moccasin. As the man and the boy conversed in their harsh-sounding language, Amos stood on quivering legs, his stomach churning until he thought he might get sick. The anger he felt toward the men melted away into fear. He and Clara and Jonathan were prisoners. There was no doubt about that. And all their walking and hiding and striving had been for nothing. They were in the hands of the Indians, with no hope of escape or rescue. With a longing that was pure pain, he felt sure he would never see his father again.